December 1944. Motor Coach Terminal 6, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Estelle Vogel sat at her dispatcher's desk in the corner office, cross-referencing fuel logs against mileage reports. She was 41 years old, and 18 of those years had been spent here, surrounded by the smell of diesel, the screech of air brakes, and the profane complaints of drivers trying to meet wartime schedules. She knew every route by heart, every mile marker, every stop. Numbers were her language, schedules her religion. Which is exactly why she noticed what nobody else had seen. Driver Elwood Whitmore, Route 34, returned his coach every 17th of the month with exactly 43 miles more on the odometer than the route called for. Not 42, not 44, exactly 43. Always on the midnight to 6 graveyard shift. No deviations noted in the trip sheets. No explanations. 43 miles to nowhere. At first, she thought she'd made an error. Then she checked the last 6 months. Then a year. Then she pulled the archive files and felt her stomach drop. This pattern had repeated for exactly 6 years and 8 months. 80 consecutive times, precise as a railroad watch. What could require exactly 43 extra miles once a month for nearly 7 years that nobody ever questioned? Estelle sat in her cramped office staring at columns of numbers while December wind howled outside, rattling the terminal's metal roof. Her fingers, stained with carbon paper and ink, trembled. She knew a sensible person would close the ledger, go home, heat up some soup, and forget the whole thing. But Estelle wasn't sensible. She was an accountant to her bones, and a discrepancy in numbers felt like a splinter under her skin. It had to come out, even if extraction hurt. Elwood Whitmore. She knew him, of course, knew all the terminal's drivers. Elwood was one of the old-timers, 23 years with the company. Army veteran from the Great War, Purple Heart, commendations from management. Quiet, courteous, didn't drink on duty, never argued with passengers. Model employee. His wife had died about 9 years back, no children, lived alone in a boarding house on Smallman Street. The other drivers respected him but kept their distance. A ghost of a man who showed up for his shift, did his job, and disappeared without leaving a trace. Estelle closed the ledger and checked the clock. 5:30 in the evening. In 2 weeks, on January 17th, Elwood had the graveyard shift again. She could confront him directly, ask him point blank. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the precision of those numbers. Too precise, too consistent, too long-running to be accident or error. This was deliberate. And if something had been done deliberately for nearly 7 years while being carefully concealed, a direct question would only produce a lie. She stood, pulled on her threadbare coat, and left the dispatcher's office. She needed to think. She needed to decide if this was even worth pursuing. She had a quiet, predictable life. A small apartment in Lawrenceville, her elderly father who listened to radio serials and smoked his pipe, her tabby cat Chester, and a job that provided stability. Why borrow someone else's secrets? Why take the risk? But as she walked across the frozen terminal yard past rows of silent coaches, one thought hammered in her head. 43 miles. Where? Why? And most importantly, how had nobody else noticed this in nearly 7 years? The next morning, Estelle arrived at work early. She pulled Whitmore's trip sheets from the archive, going back 10 years. She sat down and started copying out data. Date, mileage, departure time, return time. The numbers formed a pattern that raised every hair on her neck. Before May 1938, everything was normal. Mileage matched the route within a mile or two. Then, starting in May 1938, it began. The 17th of every month. Graveyard shift. Plus 43 miles. What happened in May 1938? She tried to remember. Almost 7 years ago. She'd only been in the dispatcher's office for about a year then. It was a wet spring, she recalled. The Allegheny had flooded. Buses couldn't make it to some neighborhoods. But what else? What important? Estelle stood and walked to the terminal manager's office. Vernon Talmadge sat behind his desk, buried in paperwork and ration vouchers, sipping coffee from a chipped mug. The manager raised weary eyes. He thought about it, scratched his jaw. Quote 3, quote 4, quote 5, quote 6. Estelle felt her pulse quicken. Quote 7, quote 8, quote 9. Talmadge shrugged. Quote 10, quote. Estelle nodded and left. So it wasn't a secret. Official assignment, special transport by city council directive. Then why didn't the trip sheets mention it? Why didn't the mileage add up? And why hadn't anyone asked questions for nearly 7 years? She returned to her desk and sat, staring out the window. Beyond the glass, light snow was falling, turning the yard into a white silence. The logic was simple. There was an official directive for special transport. There was an assigned bus and driver. But there was also the anomaly, 43 extra miles that weren't documented. Either Whitmore was genuinely carrying out some classified assignment and the extra mileage was part of it, or he was using the company coach for personal purposes under cover of the special transport authorization. But 7 years? Every month? What could anyone do that regularly for that long? Estelle took out a clean sheet of paper and wrote, January 17th, 1945, graveyard shift, Route 34, driver Whitmore. She needed to see with her own eyes where those 43 miles went. January 17th was bitterly cold and dark. Estelle left work early, claiming a headache. She told her father she'd be visiting a friend. She didn't have friends, but her father didn't ask. By 11 o'clock, she stood at a bus stop across from the terminal, wrapped in her old coat. She had a thermos of coffee in one hand, a flashlight in her pocket. She felt ridiculous, like a schoolgirl playing detective. But curiosity was stronger than shame. At 11:20, a General Motors TDH 3610 coach, number 847, rolled out of the terminal gates. Elwood Whitmore at the wheel. Estelle could see his silhouette in the driver's compartment, straight-backed, military bearing. The coach turned onto Liberty Avenue and headed toward downtown. Estelle quickly flagged a gypsy cab, a beaten Packard driven by a sleepy older man. She said, feeling like a character from a dime novel. The cabbie looked at her suspiciously. The coach followed its route, stop after stop. There were almost no passengers. The midnight city slept. Estelle watched through the window, trying to anticipate where the deviation would begin. But Whitmore stuck to his schedule precisely. Downtown, the Strip District, past the steel mills. Everything by the book. Then, at the end terminal near the Westinghouse plant in East Pittsburgh, instead of turning around to head back, the coach turned north onto an unmarked service road into the industrial zone. Underscore quote underscore 15 underscore underscore underscore. Estelle said, and the cabbie reluctantly followed. The coach rolled down an empty road past factory buildings. The streetlights here were sparse, and the coach's headlights seemed like the only illumination in a black void. After about 15 minutes, the paved road ended. Ahead lay an overgrown lot, and beyond that, dark woods. I ain't going no further, the cabbie said. There's no road ahead. Fine. Estelle paid and got out. The coach sat about 50 yards away at the edge of the lot. Engine running, headlights on. Estelle moved carefully along the brush line, trying to stay quiet. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it could be heard a mile away. And then she saw them. From the darkness of the woods, illuminated by the headlight beams, people emerged. Slowly, in an irregular line. About 30 individuals. They walked in silence, like shadows. All wore identical gray hospital robes. Some had white bandages on their heads. They moved strangely. Some shuffled, some walked sideways, some stopped and stood staring into space until someone behind pushed them forward. Estelle froze. The coach doors opened. Elwood stepped out of the driver's compartment, stood at the entrance. He said something, but the words didn't carry. The people in gray robes began boarding. Slowly, obediently, like cattle to slaughter. When everyone was inside, the doors closed. Elwood returned to his seat. The coach turned around and rolled back the way it came. Estelle stood in the bushes, shaking from cold and terror. She didn't understand what she'd just witnessed. Who were these people? Where had they come from, emerging from the woods in the middle of the night? Where was Whitmore taking them? And most importantly, why was all of this happening in such eerie silence? She waited until the coach disappeared from view, then cautiously moved toward the woods. Where those people had come from, there must be a trail or road. She turned on her flashlight. The beam picked out bare birch trunks, wet leaves underfoot, a broken fence of rusted wire. And a sign. Weathered, tilted, but still legible. Allegheny County State Hospital. Ward D. No trespassing. Estelle exhaled. So that's where they came from. A state hospital. Patients. Whitmore was transporting patients. But why? Where to? And why at night, secretly, through the woods? She walked back to the road and stood for a long time, not knowing what to do. She could go home, forget what she'd seen. But then the questions would remain unanswered. And Estelle hated unanswered questions. The next day, she went to the county health department. A young woman at the desk smiled politely. "Excuse me, can you tell me about the Allegheny County State Hospital, Ward D?" The woman frowned. Ward D? One moment. She flipped through a thick registry. I don't see a Ward D listed. We have wards A, B, and C at the main facility. There's no Ward D. But I saw the sign, Estelle insisted. The woman shrugged. Maybe it's old. A ward that was closed or renamed. I've only been here 6 months. Estelle left the building. Ward D officially didn't exist. But the sign was there, the patients were there, and every month they were being transported somewhere by bus. This wasn't just odd anymore. This was something far worse. She needed more information. The next morning, Estelle took a half-day off work and traveled to the main Allegheny County State Hospital complex. She asked to speak with someone in administration about Ward D. After a long wait, she was shown to an office where a thin, nervous man in his 50s sat behind a cluttered desk. A nameplate read, Leonard Ashford, Deputy Administrator. Miss Vogel, I understand you have questions about one of our facilities? Ward D. I saw the sign out near the East Pittsburgh woods, but the health department says it doesn't exist. Ashford's face went carefully blank. Quote 28, quote 29, quote. The color drained from Ashford's face. He glanced at the door, then lowered his voice. Miss Vogel, I don't know what you think you saw, but I strongly suggest you let this matter drop, for your own good. What's happening to those people? I can't discuss patient transfers. That's confidential medical information. Are they being used for experiments? Ashford stood abruptly. This meeting is over. Good day, Miss Vogel. She left the hospital with more questions than answers. But now she had a name. Leonard Ashford. A man who knew something and was terrified to speak. Back at the terminal, Estelle sat at her desk. She needed to know where Whitmore was taking those people. On February 17th, Estelle called in sick and stationed herself near the woods again, this time with a better coat and binoculars. She watched the same ritual. People emerging from the forest, boarding the coach, Whitmore driving away. She followed at a distance in another gypsy cab. The coach traveled back through East Pittsburgh, then continued west past the city limits into open country. After about 20 miles, it turned onto a private road marked only by a small sign. U.S. Army Medical Research Facility. Authorized personnel only. Estelle's cab stopped at the gate. A uniformed guard stepped out. Estelle said quickly. The cab turned around. Through the rear window, Estelle saw the coach passing through the gate. So that was the destination. A military medical research facility. The patients from the non-existent Ward D were being transported to Army doctors. For what purpose? Over the following weeks, Estelle gathered what information she could. She learned that the Army Medical Research Facility had been established in 1938, the same year Whitmore's extra mileage began. Its stated purpose was advancement of military medicine and treatment of combat-related psychological conditions. But everything about it was classified. She tried writing to the county medical examiner, to the health commissioner, to her congressman. The responses, when they came at all, were variations on the same theme. The matter you describe falls under federal jurisdiction and wartime security protocols. We are unable to provide information or intervene. In March 1945, Estelle decided to try a different approach. She knew a reporter named Harvey Dalrymple who worked for the Pittsburgh Press. They'd met years ago at a church social. She called him. Quote, 42. They met at a diner in Oakland. Estelle laid out everything she knew: the extra mileage, the midnight transports, the patients from the non-existent ward, the military facility. Harvey listened, taking notes. When she finished, he sat back and lit a cigarette. He grimaced. Harvey stubbed out his cigarette. Estelle felt sick. 3 weeks later, Harvey called her. Estelle whispered. Harvey was quiet for a moment. Estelle thanked him and hung up. She sat in her apartment that night, staring at the wall. 240 people. Veterans. Men who'd served their country in one war, only to be used as guinea pigs in the next. She couldn't let this go. In April 1945, she did something dangerous. She went back to the woods at night, carrying a camera she'd borrowed from a neighbor. When the patients emerged and boarded the coach, she took photographs from the bushes. The light was terrible. The images would be blurry. But maybe it would be enough. The flash went off. Whitmore's head snapped toward the trees. Estelle ran, crashing through the underbrush, her heart hammering. She heard shouts behind her, footsteps. She kept running until she reached a road, flagged down a passing truck, and begged the driver to take her into the city. The next day at work, Vernon Talmadge called her into his office. She felt her blood turn cold. Talmadge sighed. She left his office. But she didn't forget. The photographs came back from development. They were terrible, dark, grainy, barely showing anything. But if you looked closely, you could make out gray-clad figures boarding a bus. It wasn't much, but it was something. Estelle made copies and mailed them to Harvey Dalrymple with a note. __, quote _ 69 __. Then she waited. In May 1945, the war in Europe ended. In August, Japan surrendered. The city erupted in celebration. Estelle watched from her apartment window as people danced in the streets, car horns blaring, church bells ringing. The war was over. But the midnight transports continued. In September, Estelle tried one more time. She wrote directly to the Secretary of War in Washington, D.C. She laid out everything she knew, included copies of the photographs, and asked for an investigation. The response came 6 weeks later. A single typewritten page. __, quote _ 70 __. The letter was signed by a deputy assistant undersecretary whose name meant nothing. Estelle sat at her kitchen table, reading the letter over and over. They'd acknowledged the research existed. They'd admitted it was classified. And they'd told her, in bureaucratic language, to shut up. She thought about going to the newspapers again, to other reporters. But Harvey had warned her. Without evidence they could verify independently, no reputable paper would touch it. And anyone who did would be buried by government pressure. She was one woman against the entire apparatus of the federal government during wartime. What could she possibly do? The answer, she realized with bitter clarity, was nothing. But she couldn't unknow what she knew. She couldn't unsee those people in gray robes, shuffling into the bus like ghosts. She couldn't forget. So she did the only thing she could. She kept records. Every month, she documented when Whitmore made his midnight run. She noted the date, the mileage, everything. She kept a hidden journal, tucked in a box beneath her bed. Someday, she thought, This might matter. Someday, someone might care. The months turned into years. Estelle continued working at the terminal. Her father died in 1948. Harvey Dalrymple moved to New York for a job at a bigger paper. The city rebuilt, prospered, moved on from the war. And the transports continued. Every month, every 17th, 43 miles through the darkness. In December 1950, Estelle saw Whitmore at a bus stop downtown. She approached him. Quote, 71. He turned, recognized her. Quote, 72. Quote, 73. Quote, 74. They stood in awkward silence. Then Estelle asked, quote, 75. Whitmore shook his head slowly. Quote, 76. Quote, 77. Quote, 78. Quote, 79. Whitmore didn't answer. His silence was answer enough. Estelle felt something break inside her. How many? How many people went through that facility over 12 years? I don't know exactly. Maybe 280. And all of them? Not all. Some survived. Some were returned. But many didn't. What were they doing to them? Whitmore looked at her with tired eyes. Testing, drugs, psychological techniques, ways to break a man's mind and rebuild it, ways to make someone talk, make someone forget, make someone obey. They said it was for interrogation purposes, for the Cold War. I didn't ask questions. I was told it was patriotic service. You knew what was happening? I knew enough. I drove the bus. I saw them get on. I saw what came back. But I had orders, Miss Vogel. You follow orders. Even when they're wrong? Especially when they're wrong. That's how the system works. The bus arrived. Whitmore boarded and left. Estelle stood at the stop, tears freezing on her cheeks. That night, she went home and pulled out her hidden journal. 12 years of records. Dates, times, mileage. Evidence of systematic transport of vulnerable people to a military facility for experimentation. She thought about going public. But who would listen? The war was over. The country had moved on. People wanted to forget the dark things that happened in wartime, not dredge them up again. She put the journal back in its hiding place. Years passed. Estelle retired from the bus company in 1968. She lived alone in her apartment with Chester's successor, a tabby named Franklin. Life moved slowly, quietly. But sometimes, at night, when rain hammered the windows, she woke from nightmares. She dreamed of a bus rolling through darkness, 43 miles to nowhere, and people she couldn't save. In 1975, the Church Committee began investigating government abuses, including human experimentation. Estelle read about it in the newspaper. CIA, mind control programs, unwitting test subjects, psychiatric patients used without consent. She pulled out her journal. Maybe now, she thought, maybe now someone would care. She contacted the committee's investigators. She sent them copies of her records, her photographs, everything she had. They thanked her for her information. They took her statement. They promised to look into it. 6 months later, they sent her a letter. __quote _90__. Another dead end. In 1985, Estelle fell ill. Cancer. The doctors gave her a year, maybe 18 months. She didn't fight it hard. She was 82, tired, ready. One afternoon, lying in her hospital bed, she received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man, thin, white-haired, walking with a cane. Miss Vogel? Yes. Who are you? My name is Leonard Ashford. You came to my office 35 years ago asking questions about Ward D. Estelle remembered. The nervous administrator. I remember. I heard you were sick. I wanted to come. To tell you I'm sorry. For what? For not helping you then. I knew what was happening. I knew about the transfers. But I was scared. I had a family. I needed my job. So I kept quiet. Why tell me now? Because I'm dying too. And I wanted you to know that what you did mattered. You were the only one who tried. Most people just looked away. He pulled an envelope from his pocket and placed it on her bedside table. These are names. 32 men who were transferred from Ward D to the research facility in the last 2 years of the program. I managed to track down information about each one. Who they were, where they came from, what happened to them. I thought you should know. They existed. They had names. Estelle took the envelope with trembling hands, opened it. Inside was a list. Names, dates of birth, brief biographies. Great War veterans suffering from what they now called PTSD, men whose families couldn't cope with their symptoms and committed them to state care. Men who became convenient test subjects because nobody would miss them. __quote _101 __, she whispered. Leonard nodded and left. Estelle read the list through the night. Every name was a life, every line a tragedy. She died 2 months later, in March 1986, peacefully in her sleep. She left the journal and the list to a civil rights organization that worked on government accountability. 25 years passed. In 2011, researchers investigating Cold War-era military experiments found declassified documents confirming a Defense Department program that ran from 1938 to 1950, testing psychological manipulation techniques and experimental drugs on institutionalized psychiatric patients. The program had operated through several military medical facilities, including one in western Pennsylvania. Estelle Vogel's name appeared in one document as civilian employee showing undue interest in classified transportation operations. She had been under informal surveillance from 1945 to 1946, but her attempts to stop the program had failed. The system was too powerful. Today, Motor Coach Terminal 6 is long gone, replaced by an office park. The Allegheny County State Hospital was demolished in the 1970s. The Army Medical Research Facility was decommissioned and the buildings torn down. Nobody remembers what happened there 70 years ago. Nobody except a handful of elderly people who sometimes, in quiet moments, recall a bus rolling through the night. 43 miles to nowhere. 43 miles into oblivion. And if one of them remembers the name Estelle Vogel, they'll say, she was an ordinary woman, a bus dispatcher, an accountant, a small person. But she couldn't look away. She saw evil and tried to stop it. And though she failed, though she lost, her attempt mattered. Because where at least one person says no, evil doesn't win completely. It knows it's been seen. It knows it's been remembered. And that someday, somehow, there will be a reckoning.